to everyone. My name is Santiago from Team Colombia. I will be presenting the problem vegetable electricity. So the problem statement, some internet posts suggest that it is possible to generate electricity from photosynthesis by using a metallic network that runs from the root of the plant. So we must specifically determine if is photosynthesis involved, what are the main factors affecting the phenomenon, and how can they be optimized. So to begin, let's talk a little bit about the theoretical model of how does a plant microbial fuel cell work. So a plant microbial fuel cell depends on photosynthesis and a symbiotic relation with bacteria in soil in order to produce organic matter. This is the first step where organic matter is produced via photosynthesis, and then it will be oxidized naturally by bacteria on the roots. Later, in step 3, then the charge carriers can be harvested by electrochemical reactions at cathode and anode, and so we will obtain a potential differential that we can harness as electricity. So what are the main factors involved in this problem? So we built the following Sankey diagram to simply show what are these main factors. So the first step is photosynthesis, which leads to carbon fixation, then to redeposition, which is the exudation of organic matter to the soil. Later, microbial activity will convert this organic matter into charge carriers, such as protons and electrons, and finally, the voltaic cell will take these charge carriers in order to produce the voltage difference. So in these steps, we have some losses, as you may observe in red, as photorespiration, oxygen reduction in the microbial activity, and some internal losses that will, in fact, make our setup less efficient. So what are some parameters that we can tweak in these regions? Well, in the first 2 regions, we can select different plants and mainly environmental conditions such as luminosity, temperature, soil humidity, and pH, and many others. And on the final part, which is the voltaic cell, we can select materials and do different structural designs. So to determine if photosynthesis is indeed involved, we made the following experiment. So we will have 3 setups with the plant that you observe, and we will take advantage of what is known as photosynthetically active radiation. So what you observe on the right is the plot of how photosynthetical different wavelengths are taken into account into photosynthetical efficiency. So as you observe in the red part of the spectrum, we would obtain higher photosynthetical efficiencies. Then in the green part, there will be a valley, which is expected due to the color of chloroplast. And then on the blue side, we obtain once again a peak. So what were the results of our measurements of voltage in time? So we averaged them out in time. And what we obtain is actually something very similar to the photosynthetical active radiation spectrum, where we obtain peaks at red and a valley at green, and then a medium peak at blue. So what other experiments can we conduct? We can take into advantage the photorespiration and different metabolisms of plants in order to determine whether photosynthesis is indeed involved or not. For this, we will make a comparative experiment between a CAMP metabolism plant and a C3 plant. What is important between these plants is that C3 plants make metabolism during daytime, and CAMP plants do metabolism during nighttime. So we would expect that voltage rises today. And we made several measurements in time. This is the setup the schematic setup that we built, and we also made a control unlighted setup. So what were the results that we obtained? For the CAMP plant, what we obtained were mainly peaks of voltage at nighttime and valleys of voltage at daytime, which are the bright areas. And for the C3 plant, we obtained peaks of voltage at daytime and valleys of voltage at nighttime. For the setup, unlighted setup, we obtained that the voltage will decrease and is in fact lower in magnitude and will stabilize around 0.1 volts, which is much slower from this from the other measurements. Now, how could we model the PMFC? So What we propose is a simple Thevenin model as a first approximation. This would be assuming a linear direct current circuit. So this will be modeled by a constant DC source and an internal resistance. We can place an external load, and this way we can drain current from the setup and obtain its characteristics. So why does the open circuit voltage occur? Well, we can explain this by the Nernst equations, and which could theoretically calculate the differential potential between the cathode and anode. However, there are conditions highly unknown in our setup, mainly the reaction quotient, which depends on the concentrations of ions in the soil. So therefore, we will simply use the standard cell potential in order to guide us in the selection of materials to build the PMFC. In this case, copper and aluminum. So is the Thevenin model accurate? I performed measurements of voltage and power as a function of resistance, of the variable resistance that we can tweak. And we plot them to see if the model, which is the red fit, actually explains this behavior. And what we found was a pretty good correlation between the experimental data and the fit proposed by the Thevenin model. So what could be causing this internal resistance? Well, in literature, we find that there are several components to internal resistance in different orders of magnitude. The main resistance are the ionic resistance of the conduction of ions in the soil, and the resistance caused by the pH difference between cathode and anode, which will be in the order of kiloohms. So what we will now see if we can reduce the soil resistivity through humidity. Why? Because humidity has been reported to lower soil resistivity. This due to the compactness of soil, which expels air gaps from the soil and improves the electrical conductivity in the setup. So we performed these experiments to different soil humidities, and we found that if you focus on the left curve, as we increase humidity, we are actually diminishing the internal resistance. How do we know this? We know this because the maximal power transfer theorem of the Thevenin model indicates that maximal power is transferred when the external resistance matches the internal resistance. So this is what you are actually observing as we go to the green. The power is increasing and the internal resistance is shifting to the left. So we compared the two methods of estimation, basically the two curves, the power and voltage transfer curves, and we obtain a pretty good matching between the internal resistance that we could estimate. Through humidity, we could minimize their internal resistance to about 6.8 kiloohms, and the Thevenin voltage that we obtained was of around 620 millivolts. So our final design that we implemented was, well, this minimization, and what we could obtain from this was an optimal power per unit of soil area of about 1.8 milliwatts per meter squared, which is significantly lower than one would expect in major power systems. But given, well, the problem is what we could minimize too. Now, we found that there were some limitations of the initial model. The experimental results showed that the voltage would be unstable as time passes, given a resistive load. So mainly the voltage would decrease. So we suggest that a new model could be replaced by a capacitance instead of a direct voltage source. So we made measurements of this, and we found the discharge and charge curves of the fuel cell. We find that effectively we could fit a kind of RC circuit to explain the discharge of the fuel cell, and which will actually depend on the external load that we found. It is on the ranges of microfarads, but as you may notice, this very mainly as we vary the external resistance. And for the fuel cell charge, we find that also an RC circuit could explain that the recharging of the fuel cell as these charges. So thank you.
My name's Simon. I'm the opponent for vegetable electricity. At first, I'd like to thank the team from Colombia for this very nice presentation. I think it was well understandable. Let me first reiterate the problem statement. The problem states that due to some internet posts, we get the idea that one can use photosynthesis to generate electricity by using a metallic network that runs through the roots of plants. But now one could argue that that is just a photovoltaic cell and that therefore the photosynthesis is actually irrelevant. We are then tasked to explain the phenomenon and specifically determine whether photosynthesis is indeed involved. And then it's asked that we optimize them with regard to specific factors. I'd like now to recapitulate the solution posed by Colombia. At first, they explained the phenomenon as a PMFC, where organic matter is produced by photosynthesis, which is then oxidized by bacteria in the soil and producing charged particles. Which they used as a theoretical model. They then created an experimental setup with which they could verify this hypothesis, and they also checked whether photosynthesis is involved by artificially creating radiation to induce photosynthesis. They also investigated the difference between night and daytime active plants, and also by checking how their voltages, how their produced energy works in different time slots. And then they modeled the PMFC as a linear direct current circuit, through which they could introduce the Nernst equation to select for different cell materials. Then they found a unstable voltage which they explained with the Thieven model, where they modeled the circuit with a capacitance, and then they can also consider the soil humidity as a parameter to lower the soil's internal resistance by pushing air out of the soil. Also, they quantified the Thieven voltage and the internal resistance experimentally, and they measured the maximum power generated by the PMFC. They also proposed the introduction of the RC circuit model to better describe discharge, as I previously stated, and the charge of the plant cell. And they verified the charging and discharging behavior also experimentally, which they predicted beforehand. In general, here you can see one of the schematics they showed, where you can clearly see on the right side the schematic of the setup, where you have the anode chamber, the cathode chamber, and the plant that's generating the organic waste material. And on the left side, you can see the part that further processes the organic matter. It's split into an anode and a cathode. On the anode, there is an electron production, which the electroorganisms then deposit the electrons into the anode, which then travels to the cathode to then react to H2O with oxygen, which then describes a normal current. There were a few good points. You had a good visual representation. You also provided a very good overview of the theory. And it was nice. It was a nicely chosen experiment to see if the photosynthesis was involved, because you controlled for the production, and you created a link between the production to the production of energy to the photosynthesis. And there was actually a nice explanation of the reducing voltage using the capacitance with which you could explain the voltage derivations. There were also some drawbacks. For example, you did not investigate the effect of temperature, how it involves the microbial activity or the photosynthesis. You focused your optimization on limiting the internal resistance of the soil, whereas there are other factors that I'd like to talk about later. You ignored the surface area of the different plants, and you did not check if another effect is involved, which I'd like then to come to our further discussion, enter into the further discussion. My first question will be if you tried different anode materials, such as graphite, stainless steel, and platinum, and if so, how did it influence your experiment or your voltages produced?
Right. So no, mainly the two that were tested were iron and aluminum for the first setup of the photosynthetically active radiation, and copper and aluminum for the second setup of the optimization. So yeah, no, these in particular were not tested, mainly due to availability and well, focused as I explained on the standard cell potentials. Mainly that was the criteria to select those two.
But you did not check for whether you're like these nernst potential, whether there are maybe other effects that could influence that different materials are working better or less. So you just chose, okay.
Right, so there was a high unknown on the experimental setup that we had, which was the reaction quotient, right? So this is what prevents us from actually checking the nernst potentials and why we use the standard cell potentials. So yeah, we did not test these ones in particular or others further than the copper and aluminum for the optimization.
Thank you. With the reaction, did you also try different substrates? Such like from what I got, you tried it in water. Did you also try glucose, sucrose, or others that should influence because because there are electrolytes in the cell? Do you think that would, if you didn't test them, do you think that would influence the production?
Yeah, I would agree that that would be an interesting point to investigate. Mainly, well, other than conductivity, my main interest in those that you propose are in the bacterial growth and bacterial consumption and production of charge carriers. So, injecting glucose perhaps to the soil, well, depending on the bacteria that you particularly have and a better study of their respiration
So you
could
so
yield
you
higher charge carriers.
so you mean like if you could feed the bacteria explicitly, but wouldn't that like violate experimental parameters? Because if you fed the bacteria specifically, then maybe not just the growth, but also their production would change.
Yes, but it could be boosted. So it could be an interesting and favorable quality to perhaps
So you mean like a
increment the charge carriers that are produced.
okay. Then to that point, did you also investigate the effect of temperature? Because I think the microbial growth or the photosynthesis of the plants might be influenced by the temperature.
Right. So as we mentioned, plant selection is a very important part. We focused on the Sankey diagram that we showed. We focused on the latter part, right? So yes, I do indeed I believe that the effect of temperature, depending on the plant that one has and its particular parameters, could in fact affect the voltage and the power production.
Also, just on the part of the plant, or do you also think it would affect microbial, like the work of the microbes that they may, because some proteins like work better at higher or lower temperatures, so their metabolism could maybe change. Did you see anything there, or do you have a guess where that could go? Like,
right. So there we also have a limit, right? Indeed, some bacteria usually improve their respiration with temperature. However, there is a limit where proteins are going to be denaturalized, and the actual reproduction of bacteria will actually decay. So we should have a certain limit there.
yeah,
But
like,
in general, I would expect that higher temperatures might boost the voltage production of the PMFC.
all right, then let us get to a different point. Did you control the size of the plants because, or especially their like the surface area? Because I can imagine that that massively influences their photosynthesis production. Did you somehow measure how much surface they had or their size, or did you not control for that?
Right, but on size you mean the actual like surface area, for example, of the leaves, so to speak.
Yeah.
All teams can join now?
Yeah, so yes, of course, controlling this would be quite difficult. So no, this was not controlled in that sense of the surface area of the leaves.
Maybe you could control the surface area, for example, if you took photos of the plant and maybe tried a machine learning algorithm to extract the surface area. Did you think about something like that? Like some
No.
image recognition?
No,
one thought.
but mainly I would not expect the surface area of the leaves, for example, to be that important rather than the particular aspects of biological aspects of a plant, right? So we have plants that can have a higher density of chloroplastin cells and so to speak. So
okay. That maybe let me just interject there, if you may. That brings us to a nice, different question. Why did you choose those two specific plants? Did you try for different? Did you try for different plants? Because as you just said, that might greatly influence what they produce, their production.
Sure. So you mean the CAM and C3 plants, right?
I mean that's a class of plants, right? But like
Yes.
those two classes include probably many more plants, right? Or did you maybe use fungi or something to like? Did you try different biomass producers?
Right. So no, we choose this particular plant mainly due to root system. So we expect from the theoretical model that the exudation of organic matter would actually be boosted around the roots. So the thyme plant, which was finally used in the optimization as a large root system, given the household conditions, it can have a great root system, which could boost, in that sense, the exudation of organic matter and production of charge carriers.
But you did not check whether maybe, like you assume that this is only due to the size of the root system, but couldn't there be plants that create more waste even with smaller root systems?
Right. So yes, this could depend on the interaction with the bacteria on the soil. It could happen, as you state. The range of plants that we can explore is quite wide. But yes, indeed, perhaps exploring different sorts of plants and searching in the literature more efficient exudation can take into this.
Okay, thank you for the answer to that. I'd like I see some questions there. Maybe Alexander, do you want to?
But wait, before I would like just to say a very small thing just to complement my partner.
Yeah, sure.
So I would also like to say that it's a good idea to try more wide variety of plants. But the thing that I also want to point out, just to be clear, is that I believe that for the first step, it was good enough to try different kinds of plants just to prove like the to kind of understand which are the parameters and how they should be optimized in order to gain more energy for it. But I really think that it's a good idea to make more experiments. And I would like to ask the opposers if you which would be the next step in order to choose different plants from the same kind of class. For example, in C4, how can we choose different to maximize the variation of parameters for the.
I mean, I would just get a list of different plants that are in those respective classes, and then we'll plant them and then check how much they produce. But like, I'd like to go to Alexander now.
Right. So I had another question regarding the experiments that you did do with the CAM plants and the C3 plants, which one is actually better? Because that wasn't entirely clear from my slides, from the slides.
Right. So we actually obtained very similar voltages. If by voltage, we obtained slightly higher for C3 plants, but we obtained very sharp peaks for C3 plants, while for CAM plants, we obtained kind of more smooth curves, right, in time. So And also, which is better, we believe that this actually was a pretty nice experiment because it showed a complementary behavior between the CAM and C3 plant in different moments of the day. If we believe, if we think, for example, in a power production system, that, for example, solar panels decrease at nighttime.
Okay, thank you very much.
My question is that, okay, you will model the battery with a capacitor, but the capacitor will discharge at some time. And this capacitor, in order to give continuous power, should be always charging. Have you some model of it? And also to the opponent, if he agrees that the battery could be modeled with the capacitor in the case the reporter proposed. Okay.
Yes, so the capacitor, I believe I could share the screen for a moment. So we actually found that although the model of the capacitor was done, you can observe that there is quite a flat ending of the voltage in time, right? So there is kind of a final stabilizing. So there seems not to be a moment where the capacitor fully discharges, rather than a moment where there is a equilibrium between the creation of charges and a charge demand by the external load.
So the power you provided is the final stable power.
Yes, one could think of that. The instant maximal power would be this, determined by the Thevenin curves. But if we would analyze this in further periods of time, this would be a more suitable model for this.
Okay, and does the opponent agree with this? I'm sorry. Is the opponent here?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Oh, yes. Oh, yes.
Just so I understood the question correctly, you mean to say how it can have continuous discharge when it's modeled over a charging capacitor?
Yeah, do you agree with the model proposed by the reporter? Does it suit the problem?
I think that perhaps it can be tweaked slightly by adding perhaps a resistance in parallel, which would allow discharge. I don't know. I'm just, yeah, I think maybe perhaps a slight tweak to the model like that.
I mean, I think it could also fit if the production rate by the plant is low, and because it feels as far as I understood it, there is some stored charge in the cell, and that goes down, but the plant produces something, and maybe if the production by the plant is low enough, then we can actually model it as a capacitor. But if the plant, but maybe we should include into the model that the plant produces a slight amount of current going into the capacitor.
Okay, thank you.
All right. Now, Stanislav, go ahead.
Okay.
And then Mauri.
I would like to ask the same, approximately. You have noticed that at night time, the electricity generation decreased, but didn't stop completely. What is the reason, I wonder? I think that at night time there should be no photosynthesis.
Right, so what we did was a comparative experiment with another plant that has a particular metabolism. It's a CAM plant. So this particular metabolism stores energy, light energy at daytime, but actually does the metabolism at nighttime, and therefore also exudates organic matter at these hours. So bacteria can actually boost their charge production at nighttime rather than at daytime, which happens on the C3 plants, which are the most common of plants.
All right, now, Mauri, please.
Yes, it's a question that is linked to Stanislav's one, but not exactly the same. So you showed that photosynthesis is involved, but it's not clear to me whether it's required to still have a current in your device. So it's a question for both the reporter and the opponent. Same question. If you had no photosynthesis, would you still observe a low dark current or not?
Yes, you would indeed observe a much lower one. So
And where does it come from?
Yes, so there will still be bacteria on soil naturally, and there will still be organic processes occurring there. So charge carriers, well, if we place cathode and anode, can still create charge carriers and therefore produce a current. However, it would not be as stable as with a plant.
All right, thank you. Does the opponent have anything to add?
Actually, yes. This is why we asked, relating to the fungi, if it was possible to do an experiment conducting, an experiment with fungi to have different processes that aren't related to photosynthesis, but still produce ions, perhaps. So,
all right. Thank you.
All right, then. So now the juries will decide their marks, and I ask please if they could send.
I think Roman still had one question.
Oh, but it was. Well, does anyone has any more questions?
I have more question, but it depends on you because
I think Roman did not have time to ask one.
I also have
Roman,
a question. Excuse me. Am I able to ask it now regarding the time? Hello? Can you hear me?
Well, just if it's a really quick question, yes.
All right. I have a question regarding optimization to the reporter. So let's say I have a plant right here. In 2 sentences, tell me what I need to do to get the maximum power per unit of soil area, just in 2 sentences. How do I optimize this as a power source? Let's say this one.
From our experimental evidence, make the soil more humid.
And that's it, just the humidity factor, right?
There are many other factors, but from our experimental evidence and experience and measurements, we can ascertain this.
Okay, and the opponent, do you have any more suggestions on how do I optimize this plant to be better?
You try to compress the soil.
Right.
Like usually if you maybe vibrate a plant or anything, that the soil is more compressed, because the reporter said that humidity evacuated air gaps in the soil. So maybe if you compressed it to manually extract those air gaps, that would be a possibility. Just off the top of my head.
Thank you.
All right, then.